Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, January 15th, and our friend Graham Fuller is back with us. Welcome back, Graham.
Thank you. My pleasure, Nima.
Let's talk about the situation between Israel and Hamas right now in Qatar. They're trying to make a deal under the thumb or under the pressure of the United States, which comes from not the, I do believe, not the Biden administration, but the coming administration, which is Donald Trump administration. How do you see this situation?
Yeah, it's fascinating. One of the interesting things about Trump is that he is always unpredictable. He made some very strong comments, as you know, a week or two ago when he said that if there was not a settlement and release of the hostages, that all hell would break loose in the Middle East, as if hell has not already broken loose in the Middle East for quite some time. But in any case, I think it's fascinating that Trump seems to be able to exert far greater pressure, and I would suggest even psychological pressure on Israel that Biden was completely incapable of doing. And Biden really seemed almost, um, with he was almost seen as doing Netanyahu's work for him, and Blinken was often referred to as Bibi's lawyer in Washington. So this is a very different thing. He's a tougher guy. He talks tough. He talks tougher than maybe he actually acts all the time. But I think it's a clear message that the times have changed. And, I think Trump wants to make a name for himself as a changer of the world, including bringing peace where it's been nothing but misery and war for year after year after year. I'm secretly hoping that there are some good people advising Trump in some of these areas. We know that he has appointed a lot of people who, from my perspective, are rather disturbingly pro-Israeli from their background. But times change, people change, and also we know that there are people like Colonel Douglas McGregor, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who is very outspoken, very conservative, a big Trump supporter, and has been very outspoken and harsh about Israeli politics. We know that he knows Trump, and there's reports that Trump has occasionally met with him. So I think if he is getting countervailing advice from Douglas McGregor, we are in much better shape than if we listen to some of the much more pro-Israeli voices in Washington.
Do you understand what does Trump want in the Middle East? After all, is because it seems to me that he's not interested in war, in any endless war in the Middle East. But after all, how is he going to achieve that? What's the process? We know, as you mentioned, we don't know what Donald Trump is thinking of because he's unpredictable. But when you look at the establishment, those people who are decision makers in the United States, and through the lens of Donald Trump, how can they interpret their objectives in the Middle East? And what would be the main goal of this administration, the Trump administration?
Yeah, good question. First of all, I think I would have to say that Trump's own self-interest is the number one goal for Trump. I think he wants to be seen as a global figure, far more important than the weak and impotent and incompetent and failing President Biden. He wants to show himself strong. He wants to show America strong. He wants to show himself in charge, and he wants to be admired and respected for all those things. That is not altogether bad. If you look at those to seek peace in the name of your own glory is certainly better than seeking war, as Biden has constantly done. which is not going to serve his historical record very well. So, first of all, we focus on Trump and his personal ambitions. Secondly, I think he believes that he is a negotiator by instinct. I think he has a feel for people's weaknesses that can be both good and bad, but a feel for them. And I think he knows where to press buttons in the region in the Middle East, including even with Bibi, who everyone has viewed as the super manipulator in the region. But Trump is essentially suggesting, I am stronger than you. I think this, in some ways, is a contest for power, even before Trump has come to power. That, okay, Bibi, I love you, I love Israel, but he has never said he's a Zionist, unlike Biden, who has openly said he is a Zionist, or even Blinken. I mean, it's incredible that you appoint people to these high positions with a stated position on a highly controversial issue, such as Arab Israel issues. So I think he feels he's in a position now to put pressure on Israel and bring about some change. It's quite astonishing because many would argue that the Zionist lobbies had bought American policy all along, but we've seen now. I think you may be aware of the astonishing clip from Jeffrey Sachs from a week ago, in which Sachs used extremely strong language against Netanyahu. I think he called him a son of a bitch and a warmonger and other such things. This is remarkable. It's one thing. Okay, I could expect Sachs to say that. We know Sachs, he's a remarkable man. But for Trump to replay this on the eve of his inauguration is it's a chess move, in effect, telling Bibi, look, I can command this game more effectively even than you can. You don't own Congress. You haven't bought me with Miriam Adelson's $100 million. So it's off to a very strong start. We'll see if good results come out of it.
Do you think that Donald Trump would be able to convince Netanyahu? I would argue to convince. I would stress this word because we know that last time there was an agreement, JCPOA, between Iran and the United States. Netanyahu was totally against that deal. And right now, if Donald Trump wants to do the same, wants to negotiate with Iran, I would believe that Netanyahu would be in the same position as he was before. And how powerful, with what we've seen so far, we don't know a lot about Donald Trump and his administration. Many people are believing that his administration is pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, but he is so powerful as a president. He wants to expose himself to the world, and this is Donald Trump. Do you think that he would be able to convince or maybe force Netanyahu to back down on his position about Iran?
It would be an extraordinary thing, an extraordinary accomplishment if Trump is able to pull this off. I would not have guessed that he would have moved so swiftly to alienate perhaps Netanyahu as he has done. But as I said, they are playing power politics in many ways, and I think that Donald Trump wants to establish his dominance in this relationship, which has been unheard of in the American relationship with Israel all along. I don't know. I mean, there was a very interesting interview with many months back with Rogan with Trump. A long, long 3 hour interview talking about his feelings about everything in the world. And one of the interesting things that Trump said at that point was, when I got to Washington last time, these are my words, not his. But he said, when I got to Washington the first time, I didn't know anybody. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't understand the game fully. And he said there all these people came forward saying, I've got the perfect candidate for you to choose to be the, Secretary of State or in this position. And Trump said, I honestly wasn't quite sure who I was dealing with. And then later it turned out that these people were disloyal, not the kind of people I wanted, but it was rather later in the game. I think this time Trump has been criticized by some in the Democratic Party as being essentially appointing loyalists. But it's an interesting perspective because when you appoint a loyalist, you damn well expect the loyalist to do what you tell him to do and not fulfill their own agenda. And in the case of so many of these appointees of Trump the first time around, they did not do what Trump wanted. They did what they fulfilled their own agenda. This time, I think Trump is, in a position that to demand that these people do what they want. Hopefully, they will be wise. Hopefully Trump's desires will be wise, but it's a change, and he has learned something. So, yes, I expect that he will be able to exert greater power even across the Zionist lobby and even maybe the more Zionist, pro Zionist Congress than anyone else has been able to do so before. But I don't want to get too optimistic too early.
Yeah. Graham, there is a big discussion between many experts. In the main question is who's running the show? Is the United States running the show? Is Israel in charge of what's going on in the Middle East? Or a combination of forces which we call Zionist? It doesn't matter, they're Jew, Christian, liberal, whatever. These Zionists are in power of these sort of policies.
Yes, and of course, you would include within that group the neoconservatives, who may not nominally be pro Zionist, but are, I think, de facto pro Zionist. Um, I think most observers would have to say that Israel has an extraordinarily powerful influence over American policy, has had traditionally, but some presidents have been more open, or we could say weaker, in being exposed to those pro-Israeli forces than others. Um, I think there I think, ironically, Israel has done extraordinary damage to itself with this whole Gaza campaign, in terms of its public image and its reputation, not just in the United States, but in the world. It makes it very, very difficult for people who might be inclined to be sympathetic towards Israel now to say this is unacceptable, this is genocide, this is inhumane kind of policies that are being carried out. And furthermore, as some people have pointed out, I would be among them, that I think Bibi Netanyahu all along has had a grand agenda. That was the thing that was very clear after the 7 October, the horrible attack against Israel and the kibbutzim in Israel. Okay, we all expected that Israel would move to extract vengeance from Hamas, from the Palestinians. Okay, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, very ugly, brutal campaign to send a message to punish Hamas and others. But this wasn't 2 weeks. It was very clear to me after a couple of weeks that Israel was going for something much, much bigger, namely an ethnic cleansing campaign. There's no other way to describe what's been going on other than a desire to drive all Palestinians out of the West Bank, out of Gaza, and to weaken even sympathetic neighbors such as Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I think, given this perspective, many people have realized that something more is going on here, and that even the possibility of a war between the United States and Iran is quite possible, and that indeed that is probably Bibi Netanyahu's goal. I think perhaps I'm guessing here now. I'm guessing that Trump is possibly angered at the thought that he could be pushed into war against his own will and in the interests of Israel, who has lost huge support within the United States, within around the world, and even among large segments of the Jewish community. So in this way, I just see a very different game now going on, beginning to possibly break the stranglehold, if you will, of the Zionist lobby over American policies that would have been much more difficult had Israel not behaved in this exceptionally brutal and violent way in Gaza and the West Bank.
Yeah, since you've mentioned many Jews are criticizing Israel for what they're doing in the Middle East, here is a Israeli historian talking about the Zionism and the future of Zionism. Graham.
Willing to say with some caution that this is the last phase of Zionism. Historically, such development in ideological movements, whether they are colonials or empires, doesn't matter in the past. It's usually the final chapter, the ruthless one, the most ambitious one, and then it's too much. And then they fall and collapse.
Yeah.
That's a
Do you,
terrific clip. That's a terrific clip, Nima. And Elon Papa is an extraordinary and deeply respected individual. Yeah, I mean, you can love Israel, but you don't have to be a Zionist. I mean, we all know that Zionism is a very what's a range, but a specific ideology that insists on a Jewish state for Jews and only for Jews, essentially. So I think there is increasing hostility to Zionism as an ideology, and among Jews who would say, look, we would simply want a nationalist state, but it does not need to be ethnically and religiously limited to Jews. That's not the real world today. I mean, you can imagine what would happen if Germany described itself as a German state. I mean, the world would be outraged. Seemingly innocent statement, but the idea of a German state has suggestions of much more than simply the reality of the language and culture of the country.
and the other point that he's talking about, this historian, Israeli historian, is that he's linking the Zionism to colonialism. And this is the final phase of this sort of mindset ideology. Do you think that you're getting to the point that colonialism is not anymore accepted by the majority of people on the earth?
Certainly, I think colonialism has not really been accepted by a majority of people on the earth for quite some time. But the problem is that the Western nations, especially Washington, UK, and the EU, are all ex-colonial countries of one sort or another, and they have exercised the power both militarily and politically in institutions such as the UN. So yes, I think now there's a greater acceptance, perhaps even on the part of the creators of Western creators of colonialism, that this game is over. We cannot simply go on further along this lines. I would argue that this is one of the driving ideological and intellectual forces behind the BRICS organization as well.
Do you see any sort of end game in the mind of Netanyahu and his ilk and the Likud party? And at the same time, they're seeking a conflict with Turkey and with Egypt. And these are two important countries. Egypt is under the thumb of the United States, but Turkey is not that much under the thumb of the United States. Here comes the question, in my opinion, in the mind of these people who are coming to the power in Washington. What do they want with Israel? Or do they really want a continuous fight with each and every country in that region, which is huge, which is devastating for the big picture that the United States has in its mind in terms of this multipolar world, that it doesn't make sense after all. How do you see these people in Israel and the policy in Washington?
Well, I think you know very well, Nima, that the power of the Zionist lobby is quite extraordinary, both financially and also, I would argue, intellectually, in the sense that I think pro-Zionist elements have become have been able to assume very powerful positions within the Western media. So if you read the New York Times over the last 20 or 30 years, you never get anything other than a generally pro-Israeli line. Even that has shifted slightly due to these outrages of Israeli policy in Gaza, but that is still a reality in Washington. I think there's the wonderful comment by Mark Twain many years back, 100 years ago, that America has the finest Congress that money can buy. Um, so there's a lot of money and intellectual power behind this. When Washington Post and the New York Times follow a particular line, it's predictable that the BBC and the Guardian and the London Times will follow in the same direction. We see this even in the case of the Ukraine war, where Washington, this is of course not related to Israel, but Washington has set the tone for all of Western media, all of Western mainstream narrative on these issues. So now, frankly, I find it difficult to imagine that Israeli lobby power in Congress will be able to be readily not defeated, but even diminished, certainly to some degree, to the extent that Trump can explain that American interests, he's not the president of Israel. He wants to make America great again, not Israel great again, or not Europe great again, but to make America great again. To the extent that he can link these two ideas, that we are struggling for our own independent interests. And yes, we love Israel and we have great sympathy for the Israeli interests and history, but we also have our own country, and we will not be dragged into war, which will be probably disastrous, and secondly, very harmful to U.S. interests. I think that message is maybe slowly sinking in to one degree or another, but I wouldn't expect it tomorrow. And simply within Israel itself, as you know, Netanyahu is riding very, very high in the polls as a result of all of these policies he's conducted, the ethnic cleansing, the assassinations of major leaders, Arab leaders, Hamas, Hezbollah, people like this. So I don't think we can turn this game around very quickly. But yes, something is happening. Times are changing, and Trump does not have that ideological commitment. In effect, it's almost praise to say that he's committed to nobody except himself and his view of what is in America's interest.
Here is the question: how much leverage does the United States president have on the foreign policy toward Israel? Because Bernie Sanders, here is Bernie Sanders talking about the way he was trying to stop sending weapons to Israel due to the Israeli behavior in Gaza. Here is what he said on his talk with Jon Stewart.
Critical. I don't know what your view is of what Netanyahu has been doing in Gaza. Okay.
Brother, preaching to to the,
Okay.
I would say choir, but you and I both probably had to go to a synagogue. So I don't know what I'm preaching to the cantor.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I introduced legislation that would stop arms sales to Netanyahu. We got 19 votes, which observers thought was very significant.
Right.
Significant majority of people who consider themselves Democrats agree with us. I got 19 votes. Okay? The American people do not believe that we should be supporting a government that is starving children right now as we speak. But if you stand up, you're going to find that AIPAC and other billionaire-funded super PACs are going to go to war against you, putting huge amounts of money in a primary in your general election. So it's not a question of not understanding. There are many members of the Senate who will come to you privately and say, my God, what Netanyahu is doing is outrageous. I just can't vote because money is going to come and destroy my political career. So you got to get at the root of everything, not at everything, but a key part of this whole discussion, John, is money in politics. People cannot vote their conscience. They can't vote their intelligence when they know if they vote against the corporate world or the big money world, they're going to get defeated at the polls.
Yeah, here is the point which is a very important point by Bernie Sanders, who knows the Congress, who knows how does it work. Here comes the question: if we assume that Donald Trump wants to change the policy, is he going to be able to do that?
That's the $64,000 question. Nobody knows. But as I suggested earlier, I think Israel is perhaps in the weakest moral position that it has ever been in the United States, and including alienating large numbers of Jews, American Jews. Now, AIPAC is not concerned with those issues. AIPAC's mission in the world is to promote Israeli interests in the United States. So I cannot see them reversing or changing that policy anytime soon. But I think the mood of the country, the mood of Washington can change. I would argue even is changing to the extent that the outrages of Israeli attacks in Gaza and the West Bank are alienating, making it much more difficult for senators and congressmen to simply say, yes, sir, we agree with you, AIPAC, and we will support your views. At the least, they might push back a little harder. And I would hope that, I assume that AIPAC is reporting back in great detail to Israel as to the amount of, as to their capability and strength in pursuing the old AIPAC policies just forever and forever and forever. So in that way, times are changing, but it's going to be tough, and particularly in Congress and particularly in the media.
Lebanon is facing new changes in the presidency, in the new prime minister of Lebanon. We have two mindsets right now in Lebanon: Hezbollah and these people who came in power. Are they going to communicate, in your opinion? Are they going to find some sort of compromise and cooperation, or are we going to have a more destabilized Lebanon in the future?
Well, sadly, I would have to say that I don't think this depends on Lebanon at all. I think it depends very greatly on what the great powers, and especially the U.S., wants. So the U.S. has always had its own favored candidates in these elections, and obviously Hezbollah has not been among those groups. So I think a lot will depend on how much Washington is going to push hard to maintain its supporters in Lebanon, who especially come from the Christian community, especially Maronite Christian community, and also the other larger Christian communities within the country. I suspect that maybe Washington will be cutting back a little bit on intervention. I mean, it's already such a mess that you don't want to get involved, but it doesn't depend on Lebanon at all. Sadly, it depends on mainly on what Washington does. France also has some impact. And we haven't talked about Russia, but that's a whole other issue that I think is a factor in this Israeli game. It's more subtle, but it's a significant factor. If I might just say a word or two on that point, Nima.
Go ahead.
We all know that Trump has said that he knows how to deal with Putin. I think there is some degree of truth to it. He prides Trump prides himself on his ability to talk to difficult people who are perceived as the enemy, including the amazing three meetings that Trump had with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, which was stunning. No American had ever met them with them before. So, or especially a president. So I think he prides himself on this ability to negotiate. He's made, as you know, very positive noises about bringing an end to the war in Ukraine. We'll see how that goes. But certainly, Russia has great interest in the whole situation and position of Iran within the Middle East. And I don't think Russia will want to see Iran destroyed as a significant political, let's not talk about even military, but as a political force in the region. And to that extent, I can imagine Trump maybe even listening slightly to what Putin has to say on the question of Iran, including whether there should be a renewal of the nuclear arms treaty, nuclear development treaty. I don't hear you, Nima.
Yeah. What's so amazing to me, Graham, was Anthony Blinken being in power in charge of the U.S. foreign policy. He's coming from Ukraine, and he has a lot with the conflict in Ukraine, and not just Anthony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, and all these folks together are. And on the other hand, when he went to Israel, he said, I'm a Jew, I'm a Zionist, and whatever he wants. But with the situation of Biden, and we know that he hasn't been in charge for I don't know for how many months, but it was all Anthony Blinken's policy so far. This guy has destroyed the situation. You look at Ukraine, you look at the Middle East. There is no policy out there. But right now, he's bragging in his latest interview with New York Times. He was bragging about how successful he was in implementing those policies. Do you see any sort of measures for these people in Washington, and who's controlling these people? Because if Donald Trump with his policies can make a deal right now before coming to power between Hamas and Israel, why did the Biden administration, why did Anthony Blinken not decide to do that?
Well, Nima, you answered your
question right now.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
You answered your own question in part, is that Blinken has declared himself not only Jewish, which is fair enough, but also, when you say you're a Zionist and sympathetic with that, that's going another major step forward. I think Blinken has been one of the weakest and poorest secretaries of state that the U.S. has seen for a long time, and he has rivals in that contest. But I think it would be simplistic to suggest that it's essentially and only Blinken. I mean, we both talked recently about Biden's mention of himself as a Zionist. He's not even Jewish, but as a Zionist. And we have congressional power. We have through AIPAC and others within that group, the neocons. So I think there are a lot of people in charge, if you will, maybe competing for influence, even where Biden has been really out of the picture mentally and intellectually for quite some time. Um, I I don't know who is in charge. Some people even say that Jill Biden is, but we don't know. Sadly, that's the way government's going to work. The deep state, the people who are behind the scenes. Some people who will read the New York Times will believe Blinken that has fulfilled his obligations as a great Secretary of State. I think it's nonsense, but um, we'll see. I am a little nervous about Marco Rubio. Again, he's somebody who's of an outspoken background as sympathetic to Israel. I mean, after all, he's the governor of Florida, which is perhaps the most powerful. That and New York State, perhaps the two most powerful. Two states where the Jewish lobby is the most powerful. But again, we come back to the very interesting question: will Marco Rubio be loyal to Trump and Trump's wishes, or will he pursue his own agenda? I think Trump this time around is making it very clear that I'm calling the shots. I am calling American foreign policy, and I'm even going to try to call the shots with Bibi Netanyahu. I don't know, Mr. Rubio, what your particular interests are, but I'm telling you I'm president, and this is what I want to do, and this is what we are going to do.
The other player in the Middle East is Russia, as you've mentioned. It's so important in the Middle East. Biden recently said that Russia and Iran were defeated, and he was talking about Syria. But after all, do you consider that any sort of agreement in Ukraine would make some sort of cooperation between the United States and Russia in terms of the Middle East, or we are not getting to that point because the Russians are so confused with the United States in Ukraine. They don't know what these people want to do, as you know. And the Waltz, he's going to replace Jake Sullivan in Washington. He's believing that the Ukrainians need to reduce the drafting age from 27 to 18. They're talking nonsense about the war in Ukraine because it's unbelievable the situation in Ukraine. How do you see the cooperation between the United States and Russia under Donald Trump?
I was quite shocked by that statement urging Ukraine to lower the draft age. I frankly think it's deeply immoral because everyone knows that the war functionally is over. Okay, it's going to take maybe few more weeks, some kinds of negotiation, et cetera, et cetera. But to urge that an entire new generation of young men they be sent into battle where we know they are going to be defeated, we know they are going to die, and it is going to simply make greater wreckage economically, sociologically in Ukraine. So I view it as really quite immoral. On the question of bringing peace to bringing successful negotiation to the end the war in Ukraine, there are those hardliners, as you know, who have said that if we have anything less than a complete American victory, that we are sending a signal to the world that America is now weak and unable to enforce its will and desire, and therefore this is very important. They will say that because we abandoned or got out of Afghanistan, that therefore we demonstrated to the world that we were weak, and that emboldened Russia to do what it did in Ukraine. There's a lot of this ideological nonsense, but I think Putin is a very smart guy. He's certainly smarter than probably most policymakers in Washington today. And Lavrov is an extremely competent foreign secretary. I don't have to approve of all of Russia's policies, but I can certainly they have deep understanding of how foreign policy works. So I think Russia clearly understands that there's a shift of the game in Washington, and that for them to react to every single missile and rocket that Ukraine sends, even into Russia proper, yes, it's an outrage. And if there was a change in government not coming in Washington, perhaps we would see a much sharper Russian response to these missiles that are being sent into Russian territory. By the way, I can't believe that America is not fully aware of and fully supportive of this policy. So I think Putin and Lavrov understand that this is not the time to move in even more dangerous confrontation than they are. I mean, you can think of this as almost sort of a wild savage dog that is cornered, and that you don't want to simply poke a stick at the dog and make it more enraged and more enraged when you think that those policies are irrational. Some people may not agree that it's irrational, but certainly I think the Russians would view that this is a very dangerous time to be further provoking Washington, when hopefully there will be some change on the horizon. I would argue, by the way, the same way applies to China, that China knows that this is not a smart time to be further provoking Washington or responding to American provocations in stronger ways, when change could be coming that would be more desirable. So here, I think this is where maybe even a deal that would include Russia in the Iranian nuclear issue is quite possible, and I would hope that there could be some greater cooperation between Russia and the United States. Otherwise, strong support for this is not going to come from anywhere else. The Europeans essentially are without leadership and have no policies except what NATO says. So this would be a very important form of cooperation that could be very desirable in many international issues that Trump is not rushing to demonize. That Trump is not rushing to demonize Russia and Putin in the way that so many of the people around Biden consistently do, and as American Congress does. This is just not smart diplomacy, period.
In terms of the relationship between Iran and the United States, which doesn't exist, but Donald Trump, in my opinion, many people are arguing that Donald Trump may attack Iran, I don't know, a big fight, a big war with Iran. I don't believe any sort of fight and war on the part of Trump. He's not interested in war with Iran. But when it comes to as he mentioned before 2024, in many interviews, he has mentioned that his main concern is Iranian nuclear program. If that's the case, we know that he was responsible. Actually, he has decided to withdraw from JCPOA, that comprehensive agreement, nuclear agreement between Iran and the United States. What does he want from this agreement? Does he want to make more modifications on the terms that they have agreed on in those days, or he wants to put his name under the nuclear deal and say, this is Donald Trump and I'm doing this is the best deal that you can get.
I think that's a very good point, Nima, that you make. Um, we both agree that Trump is unpredictable. It is not inconceivable that Trump might decide to move militarily against Iran. But I tend to agree with you that I think it will not. And this may be where Trump is angered by Bibi Netanyahu in clearly attempting to maneuver and force Washington into supporting an Israeli war and an Israeli attack against Iran. Um, so I wouldn't want to predict that Trump will not move in that direction, but if he can put his name, and that's the term you used, and I think that's a very good expression. If he can put his name on it in a way that Biden was not able to do, this will be a triumph. I also think it's fascinating, though, to see that William Burns, the chief of CIA, just I think yesterday, and this is his last few days in power as chief of CIA, said that there was no evidence yet whatsoever. I believe that's the word he used. No evidence whatsoever that Iran was working on developing a nuclear bomb, a weapon was the terms he used. Maybe some enrichment of some kind, I don't know. But that was very significant words coming out of the chief of CIA in his very last days, when I'm sure that this is not what Biden wants to hear, or Blinken wants to hear, or Sullivan wants to hear. And it's really a gift, if you will, to Trump in removing perhaps some of the pressure for military hostilities against Iran, or with supporting Bibi Netanyahu in that same move. I've been a great admirer of William Burns going back some years as chief of CIA. I was only a bit dismayed that it seemed to me in the last year that he has echoed the administration's voice a bit more than I thought was appropriate on both Ukraine and on Israel. But this seems to be a return to the old William Burns, who's telling it like it is. That's an important gift to Trump.
Here is what Bill Burns said, exactly the words.
Okay.
He said that Iran made a decision in 2003 not to pursue nuclear weapons and has not changed its policy. And he's just giving some sort of hope to the Trump administration that they can go after some sort of negotiations. And here comes the question that which is the bigger picture of the Middle East, Grant. Do you think that the situation in Syria and what's going in Gaza is in favor of Israel and the future, and then the policy that the Biden administration has been implemented so far because the Biden himself 2 days ago said that we have defeated Iran and Russia in Syria, but it doesn't seem that it's a huge victory for Israel or the United States in Syria. We know that the situation is much more complicated, and these people are still just finding their ways to power. They don't say anything against Israel, but it's not going to be the same in the near future, in 10 years, in 5 years. It's going to change. Do you see this going to be considered, this picture going to be considered by the Trump administration?
I think superficially, almost any observer would have to say that the coup in Syria was a victory or a triumph, let's say, or success, let's say, perhaps a success for Israel and for American policy, perhaps, and certainly a setback for Iran and Russia. No question, in my view. But that's talking very short term, very tactically. Yes, now it's much more difficult for Iran to send any weapons to Hezbollah. It's much more difficult for Russia to become quickly re-involved in the situation. But I stress that's a tactical situation. Nothing remains the same. We don't know very much about the new administration in Syria. And I think it would be preposterous to think that Russia has somehow now will now disappear from a active role in the Middle East in the future. I would expect that the new regime in Syria will not want to alienate Russia at all. Certainly, they know enough about American policies, both in Gaza and in Palestine, other issues, that they cannot trust the United States as the sole supervisor of Syrian policy. They will seek to a policy of balance, and here Russia's role is essential. I think Turkey's role will be essential. Certainly, Iran will be a very important player, as well as the West. I mean, certainly Syria would not want to alienate Washington if it can possibly avoid that. But they're going to play all sides, and the game sooner or later will come back to its familiar profile of how Syria plays in this very complex Middle Eastern game.
2 days ago, Sergei Lavrov said that they're not leaving the Middle East. I would argue even they're expanding in the Middle East with the new deal with Iran. On January 17th, there is a comprehensive strategic deal between Iran and Russia, which would hugely influence the Middle East as a whole. How is that going to be? Is that going to change the United States or Donald Trump's policy in the Middle East, or they're going to try to adjust with the situation, with the new situation?
Very good question, Nima, and I'm not sure exactly what answer. If you had asked me that question about China, I would have said that it's very unlikely that Trump would change policies vis-a-vis China's role in the region, which so far is modest. It's real. It's political fundamentally rather than military. But when it comes to Russia, as we've said earlier today, I think Russia's a successful conclusion, working towards a successful conclusion to the Ukrainian situation, I think will facilitate an improvement in the Iranian situation as well. And I think Trump might see that he could. I'm putting an optimistic spin on this, perhaps, but Trump might see that he could leverage a relationship with Russia, not only from Ukraine, but also to negotiate another JCPOA,
JCPOA, yeah.
JCPOA, right?
Yeah. It's so difficult to pronounce. A lot of
yeah, harder to say than Persian and Arabic words. But anyway, I think he could see that there was room for joint cooperation, which could be very, very important in the region. It would weaken and affect Bibi Netanyahu's ability to call the shots by suggesting that this is the Russian threat, that the U.S. has to rise to the Russian threat, that Iran is even greater threat now to the U.S. because of Russian backing and all that kind of thing. I could see how you could turn that around and say, look, we have an opportunity here to work with Russia to lower the temperature and to repeal that agreement that I cannot pronounce once again.
JCPOA.
Yeah, right. There is grounds, I think, for some cautious optimism there. Also, let's not forget that the game has changed a little bit up and down the Gulf. The United States has spent most of its foreign policy efforts in the Persian Gulf in telling them that there is massive danger from Iran, massive dangers from Shiism, and that they need to sign up with American policies, American defense policies, buy U.S. weapons, et cetera, et cetera. That has changed now. If you notice, well, I mean, it was remarkable that China was able to pull off this negotiation between Iran and Israel. I'm sorry, Iran and
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia, exactly. Between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That was quite startling to me, unexpected. Everybody said it will never happen. Shiites hate Sunnis, blah, blah, blah. Well, it did happen. And now I think the Gulfi rulers are beginning to recognize that the world is shifting. There's interest in BRICS. They don't want to be a simply committed to a longer term American vision of the region that does not seem to be working anyway. So I think you will find less demand on the part of the Gulf states to support any anti-Iranian policies out of Washington. Washington must be getting that message. That's an important shift, not a permanent shift, but a significant shift.
Thank you so much, Graham, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
My pleasure, Nima. Thank you for the interesting questions. Take care. Khoda
Take care.
Hafiz.
Bye-bye.
Bye.